One of the most important compilers of the Maqtal of Imam Hussein was a man named Lut ibn Yahya, also known as Abu Mikhnaf. His name is often heard in the various maqatil that we read today. Who was this man, and how did he contribute to the Maqtal of Imam Hussein?
Abu Mikhnaf is regarded as one of the first historians to document what happened in Karbala. Abu Mikhnaf was born in the second half of the first Hijri century. He came from a noble family in Kufa. He was known to be the greatest historian in Kufa during his era. Now there is a discussion amongst historians as to whether he was Shia or not. It is very clear from his works that he truly loved the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. You may call him a Shi'i in the general sense of the term, that you love the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, deeply. But most scholars would dispute that he was an Imami, a Shi'i who saw the Imams as being appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abu Mikhnaf takes it upon himself to compile the Maqtal, the eulogy and the killing of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He begins to search for eyewitnesses who were there present in Karbala. And he wrote a very important book called the Maqtal of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Now, unfortunately, his book has not survived throughout history. And in fact, his 30 other books, none of them have survived history. What we know about his works is from other historians. For instance, Tabari, the famous Sunni historian, he has narrated nearly 100 narrations from Abu Mikhnaf. So you can find his narrations in the works of other historians.
What's unique about Lut ibn Yahya or Abu Mikhnaf is that what we know about him is that he was a historian. There have been many people who have sought to write about aspects or narratives of history in different periods. Not all of them had a sense of detail and nuance and methodology in the same way that Lut ibn Yahya did. When someone says that Abu Mikhnaf said this, Lut ibn Yahya said this, all of a sudden it comes with that sense of validation that this man, he understood, he knew what he was talking about.
You find that he narrates from 39 reporters. Some of these individuals he directly met, and they were eyewitnesses in Karbala. For instance, one of them is Uqba ibn Sam'an. He was the servant of Lady Rabab. Another figure that we find he spoke to directly was the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. Her name was Dalham or Dulham, the daughter of Amr. She narrates a few incidents about Karbala. She encouraged her husband, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, on his way back to Iraq from Hajj to meet Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He meets Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And you know the nur of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. When you see that light, it transforms you if you have goodness in you. He came back, he brought down the tents, he asked his wife, go to your family. I've decided to join Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and it's going to be a treacherous journey. I don't want you to be here. She narrates another incident that Abu Mikhnaf has captured for us. After the battle was over, the Imam was killed, the Shuhada were also killed. She sent one of the servants of her husband in order to put him in the kafan, to enshroud him and to bury him. So he goes to Karbala. He tries to identify the body of his master Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, and he wants to put him in the shroud, in the kafan. He realizes that the body of Imam Hussein alayhi salam has no kafan. So he says, how can I put my master in kafan, enshroud him, when Abu Abdullah al-Hussein has no kafan?
ونادت زينب وأخاه وسيداه وأهل بيته ليت السماء أطبقت على الأرض وليت الجبال تدكدكت على السهل وانتهت نحو الحسين وقد دنا منه عمر بن سعد في جماعة من أصحابه والحسين يجود بنفسه فصاحت أي عمر أيقتل أبو عبد الله وأنت تنظر إليه.
It wasn't until I was maybe 12 or 13 years old when I ended up reading what happened to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam on my own. I remember sitting in my room being so overwhelmed with emotion, crying like I never ever cried before. And every year, when I reread my notes in order to prepare majalis for the days of Ashura and to remember and recollect the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, I always have certain moments where I just stop and I can't continue. Listening to the tragedy of the Imam alayhi salam in his final moments is something that I only reserve for the day of Ashura. I can never listen to it in such detail because of how heart-wrenching it is. Likely the first maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam that was written was the maqtal of a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam, a man by the name of Asbagh bin Nubata, who was famously recollected within the pulpit with his intense love for Imam Ali alayhi salam. He lives during the lifetime of Imam Ali, of Imam al-Hassan, of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, meaning he outlived the tragedy of Karbala, and it wasn't a decade that passed, and we know that he had written a maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Unfortunately, due to the political situation, due to a whole host of reasons that probably we could only speculate upon, that work of his was unfortunately lost and we don't have it with us today. Secondly, we have the maqtal written by a man by the name of Jabir bin Yazid al-Ja'fi, who was a companion of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam and someone who was a close confidant of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. He was known as Sahib al-Sir, someone who would be exposed to the secrets of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. Unfortunately as well, the work of Jabir al-Ja'fi was also lost. A third maqtal is a maqtal written by a man by the name of Ammar bin Muawiyah al-Dahani. Unfortunately, though he was also a companion of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, we have also lost that one. We have other works, for instance, the maqtal of Shaykh al-Saduq, who is one of our greatest and most important and significant scholars, but only a portion of that has reached us. Why we are so often focusing on the work of Abi Mikhnaf is that so many of our early scholars, including al-Saduq, including the famous historian At-Tabari, they would consistently quote Abi Mikhnaf, recognizing again that it was the central authority in that which took place and transpired in the tragedy of Karbala to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam.
We have two types of maqtals, the primary maqtals and the secondary ones. The primary maqtals are like the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf. He compiled the maqtal, he gathered the information and the sources. Secondary maqatil are those maqtals who report from the primary sources. So when we say we have about 30 maqtals, we're not talking about primary maqtals. We have very few primary maqtals. We're talking about the secondary ones. Those who came after, they still had access to the primary maqtals before they basically became extinct and they were no longer in circulation. They had access to them and they would narrate from them. My analysis is that during those times, you had governments who were very hostile to the mission of Imam Hussein. Even the Abbasids, who initially came under the slogan of Al-Muhammad, the Abbasids rose to power claiming that they wanted to seek revenge for what happened to Imam Hussein. But this was just a political mechanism to assume power. Once they assumed power, they fought the visitors of Imam Hussein. We're all familiar with the role of Al-Mutawakkil al-Abbasi in trying to destroy the grave of Imam Hussein, in killing and persecuting everyone who would come to Karbala. So those governments would naturally try to bury any book about the maqtal of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. My understanding is that in those years of persecution, it was difficult to circulate the maqatil. If you were found to be distributing a maqtal, scribing it, copying it, you would be in trouble with the government. Visiting the Imam alayhi salam was seen as a threat to these governments. Imagine if you're circulating a whole maqtal about what happened to Imam Hussein, because when people would read that, they would explode with emotional power and they would rise against the evil rulers of their time. So it seems that this political repression stopped these primary sources from being circulated. And over time, they basically were lost and we don't have any trace of them, unfortunately. The good news is we have secondary sources that copied parts of these primary sources. So a lot of their content has been preserved.
When we talk about those who narrated the tragedy of Karbala, we talk about four different groups of people. The first group are those who were with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, from amongst his companions and amongst his family members, but those who outlived the Imam, salamullah alayhi, meaning that they were not killed on the day of Ashura. The most famous example is a man by the name of Uqba ibn Sam'an. Uqba ibn Sam'an was the slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Hussein, salamullah alayh. And he narrates himself that I was with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam every step of the journey from the day that we left Medina until the 10th of Muharram. Meaning that he was with the Imam salamullah alayh, and he was amongst those individuals who was exposed to the nuance and the detail of all of these conversations that took place leading up to the day of Ashura and through the day of Ashura. A second personality, as an example of those who outlived the Imam alayhi salam, is a man by the name of Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi, a man who pledged his allegiance to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam. And at the last moment on the day of Ashura, he tells the Imam alayhi salam to give him permission to rescind the pledge of allegiance that he had given him and allow for him to return back to his family because of the fear that he was imposed by the army of Umar bin Sa'd. But he was one of those who narrate the conversations that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam engaged in on the night of Ashura. The second group of individuals who narrated the tragedy of Karbala are the women and the children. For instance, we have the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, Dulham, who narrates certain events of that which took place and transpired leading up to the day of Ashura, and even that which took place after the day of Ashura. In addition to that, of course, we have those who were present from the infallible sources, like that of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, like that of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, who were present on the day of Ashura, and they were also able to narrate at least portions or minor details about that which took place, along with many women, including Lady Zainab. In addition, there's a man by the name of Hassan al-Muthanna, the son of Imam al-Hassan, salamullah alayh, the brother of Qasim. Hassan al-Muthanna was injured and wounded on the day of Ashura, and on the night of the 11th of Muharram, as the army of Umar bin Sa'd went and was gathering together the women and the children and decapitating the bodies of the family members and companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, they realized that Hassan al-Muthanna was alive, and after they saw his wounds, they let him survive, and he was amongst those who were taken as captive from Karbala to Kufa until the end of the journey. The third group of those who narrated the tragedy of Karbala were the enemy army. Someone says, why should we take what the enemies of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam have to say? In historiography, we have a principle known as the criterion for embarrassment. If someone openly admits toward committing an atrocity like killing a child, a 6-month-old infant, why would they do something like that if they truly didn't do it? There was something in their heart that allowed for them to expose the truth because they felt embarrassed by it. And because of this reality, we take the testimony and the evidence as presented by the enemy army of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam as a means to also inform that which took place on the day of Ashura. And finally, the fourth group of those who narrated the tragedy of Karbala are of course the infallible Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, Imams Zayn al-Abidin and al-Baqir, peace and blessings be upon them, who were present on the day of Ashura. And we certainly get some detail about the day of Ashura from them and their narrations, peace and blessings be upon them.
فصرف بوجهه عنها ودموعه تسيل على لحيته فقالت ويحكم أما فيكم مسلم فلم يجبها أحد ثم صاح ابن سعد بالناس انزلوا إليه وأريحوه فبدر إليه شمر فرفسه برجل.
If I was to think back at my first time reading the tragedy of Karbala, the Maqtal of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it would be about maybe 18 years ago. I opened the book of Tabari and I began reading the narration. That was maybe one of the first times that I cried and that I had tears in my eyes as I began to read it. And I began to read the details of the torture, the murder, and the terrible things that they did to the pure and beloved family of the Prophet. I began to think to myself, how could such a thing happen? I remember that day like it was yesterday. The women of Karbala have contributed greatly to the narration of the tragedy. Fatima bint al-Hussein, Zainab al-Kubra, Rubab. For example, we have a narration in Kufa when Rubab saw the head of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, she pounced on it, essentially, put it in her lap, and started crying and narrating a line of poetry, basically saying that I left my beloved on the sand of Karbala, and for the sake of his thirst and his murder, O Allah, do not irrigate this land with water again. It's a very beautiful line. Or for example, when Sayyidah Zainab is in the court of Ibn Ziyad, one of the first times we read in the Maqtal literature that she began to cry. And then she gets into a conversation with Ibn Ziyad as he's cursing Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. We have many, many narrations and instances like this. Noble women like Fatima bint al-Hussein, Fatima, the daughter of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, narrate to us some of the very gruesome details, right? She narrates, for example, in Tabari it's narrated, and other places it's narrated through her, that they broke the anklets off the legs of the women of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim as-salam.
Many people wonder, why would Imam Hussein, peace be upon him, take his family and children on such a dangerous journey? When you're going to a place with a lot of uncertainties, a lot of danger. One reason why Imam Hussein alayhi salam took his family with him to Karbala is for them to serve as the media for the mission of Karbala. Those women and children would tell the world what happened in the land of Karbala. So many of the events that we hear about Karbala, they come from the family of Imam Hussein. His sister Zainab alayhi salam, his sister Kulthum, peace be upon her. They have narrated some of the events that happened in Karbala, how they were attacked, how those children would be harassed, the night of Ashura, and how the Imam alayhi salam gathered his companions. Lady Zainab alayhi salam narrates some of these events. The children of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, like Lady Sakina, she has narrated some of these events because she survived after Karbala. She spoke about what happened in Karbala, what happened when Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was massacred, how they were taken from Karbala to Kufa, from Kufa to Sham, and the very detailed events that would happen. Lady Sakina